Okay, let's go ahead and talk about our linear shading. We've already practiced it with value scales and geometric solids. Now let's try to work on an object that's maybe organic or similar to some of the details that we might have in our place space illustrations. On the very top, I have an example of driftwood, and it has really good contrast from light to dark. I want to use this as my reference. So this is as if this object is sitting out in front of me. It's got a light source coming off from the left, and because of where the highlight is and how there's a little shadow here, that lets me know that it's on the left, but it's also in the front of the object. And that allows for the shadow to be really close and on the bottom right side. Now this one here is an example of me adding linear shading and stipple to it to make it look 3D. I kind of washed out the value so it's kind of flat here on the practice for you. What I want to make sure that you understand that the more value you add in the watercolor, so like let's say this whole thing is watercolor, the more you add in watercolor, the less work you'll have to do with lining and stipple. Stipple is going to take a lot longer. But it's up to you on which way you want to go about adding your value. Do you want to do more in watercolor? Do you want to do more with stipple? Outlining is optional, but what I want to point out with the outlining is that you don't have to outline with one line weight. So like an example here is, just going through this part and like lining it with your nice micron pen carefully, that it's like a single line thickness. Right? That's kind of boring and it just makes it look flat. What you can do is in areas of shadow like here, you can always go from thin where it's lighter to thicker where there's shadow, and then go back to thin. You can also use a broken line or a dashed line. So in areas like this that are in highlight, I can just use little dashes or dots to kind of line and clean. Most of the time people line based on the need to clean up edges because maybe watercolor made a little mistake, or they need a little bit more detail and definition to it, or maybe you're thinking about career in illustration or animation and you just want more practice on that. You can do that to kind of help with those skills. So feel free to go in here, add different line weights, keep looking at your reference at the top, right? Here it's a little bit thicker because it's in shadow. I can do some thick to thin lines, right? On the bottom edge it's in shadow, so I went a little bit thicker there. If it's an organic object, you probably want to make sure that it's kind of bumpy or irregular. If it's much more man-made, make sure it's nice and clean. You can add line definition to cracks and grooves, any three-dimensional details that would have crisp edges. And then in the shadow areas, I intentionally left this kind of flat. You can go in there and add value variations. So in the shadow right through here, the darkest part, it's going to be really, really dark. So you can add some darkness to that core of that shadow. And then you want to sprinkle them and use fewer and fewer with bigger spaces to get those gradual transitions as you move up. You'd want to do this down here, but I don't want to make a really long video, so I'm just adding it here instead. But like I said, this stipple part you want to do, it's mandatory, so I would like you to try to do it to add some more detail and definition to your work. You could start with stipple first and then decide where or if or when you actually want to add the line variation. But like I said, most of the time people use the line variation when they're trying to clean up some detail. When it comes to the cast shadow, don't outline it because it's not a physical object. Instead, use stipple to heighten it if you need to. You can see here in the dark part of the shadow, I used a lot of dots. And then in the lighter shadow where there's this second shadow because of two light sources, I spaced it a little bit farther. So when it comes to this practice, you don't necessarily have to finish the whole driftwood, but do get some practice doing some different variations of line weight from thick to thin and dash to dotted, and then also kind of work up an area of value. So like maybe you're doing this small section here, and then if you still are not satisfied, maybe you continue working on it until you feel more confident. Because what I want you to do is to be able to take this skill and apply it to your illustration without feeling like you've ruined it after you've spent so many weeks adding the detail with pencil and watercolor.